Hello everyone, and welcome to a History of Egypt podcast interview. My guest today is Dr. Peter Lacovara. Peter Lacovara is an Egyptologist and archaeologist. He completed his PhD research in 1993 at the University of Chicago in the United States. His research priority was the city of Deir el-Balas, a lesser-known palace complex dating to the late Second Intermediate Period and the very early New Kingdom. We will discuss Deir el-Balas and Peter's work there later in the interview, but first I want to talk about a specific person. From May 1998 to September 2014, Dr. Lacovara was the senior curator of ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern art at the Michael C. Carlos Museum of Art at Emory University in Atlanta in the United States. And as part of that tenure, Peter was involved in a particular project. It was under Peter Lacovara's supervision that researchers from this university may have identified the mummy of Ramesses I, the Egyptian pharaoh who established the Ramessid lineage. Dr. Lacovara graciously agreed to sit down with me to talk about Ramesses, the identification of a royal mummy, and how one actually goes about sending a mummy back to its home country. We also discussed his work at Deir el-Balas and the nature of ancient Egyptian palaces, the elaborate houses and cities that pharaohs established for their own government and personal comfort. The conversation was fascinating, and I look forward to sharing it with you. So, Dr. Lacovara, good morning, and welcome to the History of Egypt podcast.
Thank you.
And how has life been in Egyptology and archaeology since COVID and all the lockdowns? Are you getting back into the swing of things? How's it all progressing?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the lockdown wasn't bad because I could get caught up on writing and stuff, so I didn't have too much of a problem. But it's nice to be able to go back to meeting and being able to go places to do research and go back to Egypt.
Your archaeological project was recently at Deir el-Balas in late January. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep.
Any exciting updates or news from the season?
I'm trying to think. Not too much. We're doing some excavation, but in service of restoration and site protection. So we do find stuff, but most of it's restoration, site protection, and mapping and.
Excellent. And we'll talk more about that archaeological project a bit later. But the first question I sort of wanted to bring to you is regarding your involvement with certain mummy or mummified human that was in an American museum and has gone through an interesting history in its afterlife and now resides in Luxor Museum, where it is tentatively identified as the body of Ramesses I. So the History of Egypt podcast is, at the time that we're speaking, just about to embark on the reign of Ramesses I. So this is very fortuitous timing. I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you was, how did you get involved in this project? What is your experience of this particular individual and how they came into your life?
Okay, well, what happened was I'd been assistant curator in Boston for many years, and then was offered the post of curator in Michael C. Carlos Museum at Emory University in Atlanta. And I went from a very large collection to a very small one. And so one of my briefs was to try and build up the collection. And so right at that time, I heard there was an old collection that I vaguely knew about in Niagara Falls, Canada, that was for sale. And my friend Roberta Shaw at the Royal Ontario Museum had told me about it. And so we contacted the entrepreneur who bought it and was selling it off. And so I went up there to see it. And it was a very strange place. It was the museum itself had moved around. It was an old museum. It was founded in the 1820s. And had moved back and forth across the border between the US and Canada over the years, and was in an old factory building now. It had always belonged to a family, more like a Ripley's Believe It or Not kind of place than an actual museum.
Mm.
And it's crazy. And so so I went up there anyway, and they did have a very nice collection of coffins, mostly from the 21st dynasty, which is a period of very beautiful coffins. They weren't in great shape because they'd been neglected for over a century, but anyway, we had the opportunity. The guy who was selling it wanted $2 million at the time, and he wanted it right away, and we were a little despondent, but the papers in Atlanta picked up the story, and the phones were ringing off the hook because people really wanted to bring this material to Atlanta, and we were able to purchase it. But anyway, so there had been stories before that one of the items in the collection was a possible royal mummy. And what had happened was that, again, not being a real museum and not having real curators and real staff, they just made up pedigrees for these mummies. And so one of them, they said, was Nefertiti. And so in the 1970s, a wandering German tourist had stumbled in there and seen it, and went back and alerted the ZDF, and they sent out a German television crew along with Arnie Egebrecht from the Hildesheim Museum to look. And he saw it and he said, no, it was a body of a woman, probably from the 21st dynasty, but clearly not Nefertiti. But then he looked over on another shelf and saw this unwrapped mummy, and he said, but that one there, that could possibly be a royal mummy because it had its arms crossed over its chest. It was very well preserved and very, nicely mummified. So they CAT scanned it, and then they saw there were kind of two shadowy images. They'd X-rayed it, not CAT scanned it, excuse me. They X-rayed it and found two shadowy images in the chest, which they thought, well, maybe those are organ packs. And at that period, when they put organ packs in the third intermediate period, sometimes you get mummies that their hands are crossed over the chest, not royal mummies. So that sort of said, well, maybe it isn't. So anyway, when we bought the collection for Atlanta, I said there was this possibility, and if it turned out to be, we should investigate it. And if it turned out to be true, it would make sense to offer the mummy back to Egypt because it had no coffin. It was just an unwrapped body we would never display. So everyone agreed, which was great. And also actually in the collection were two little painted limestone fragments. And I saw them and I recognized them as coming from the tomb of Seti I. And the director of the museum said, that's ridiculous. How can you tell where these small pieces came from? But I thought for sure that they were from the benches, in the back room of the burial chamber. And so we made casts of them and brought them to Egypt, and they fit right in. So we returned those bits as well. But anyway, so we did a lot of research on the mummies, the mummy that purportedly was a royal mummy. We brought Salima Ikram over to look at it. We got Nova, the educational channel, interested in it. And they had hired a researcher who discovered in the records in Canada that the collection had been purchased in part from Mustafa Aga, who was the dealer who was working with the Abd el-Rasuls who found the cache of royal mummies. And of course, in the cache, they found the coffin of Ramses I, but it was empty, but had loose bandages in it. And so there was a question there because the Niagara Falls Museum went to Egypt and collected these things in the 1860s, which is a little earlier than the general date had been suggested for the discovery of the cache, but not out of the realm of possibility. And what was interesting is that if indeed it was Ramesses I and had been in the cache, and he'd been in there until it was just before it was sequestered, because it was empty then. But anyway, since they'd unwrapped it, of course he had no jewels; they were all stripped in the reburial. That's probably why the other royal mummies were left alone, that they, went through all the trouble of unwrapping him and then discovered there was nothing to be found. Anyway, so it was sold. So, the suggestion was that it could be Ramesses I. So Salima came and looked at it. And we also CAT scanned it at Emory Hospital. And we discovered that the two, what they thought were organ packs with much clearer modern equipment, we saw were not organ packs, but two tightly rolled tubes of linen. And Salima noted that there's only one other mummy that's done like that, and that's Seti I. So that was interesting. Also, there were a lot of other similarities to the mummy of Seti I. There was, on the neck was a very fine pleating of linen. Most of the wrappings were gone, but some remained intact. And there was this very fine kind of pleated linen, which again was like Seti's mummy. Also, it was covered with a very fine coat of resin, just like Seti as well. And then what was really interesting is that, again, there was a debate about the crossed arms, which after the New Kingdom, you do find non-royal people. But Salima noted the embalming scar was in the groin, which is a New Kingdom feature. By the later periods, by the Third Intermediate period, later it's in the side. So those are all things that kind of pointed to the possibility of it. And then we had Jim Harris come, who the dentist who'd worked with Kent Weeks X-raying all royal mummies. And he looked at the dentition, and it most closely matched that of Seti I. So, and he looks like, he has this very classic Ramesside nose. So he looked very much like Ramesses II and Seti I. So armed with all that possibility, and then we tried to do DNA, but it's for various reasons was very difficult to get any viable DNA out of a mummy. But we decided the aggregate information was enough that, in all probability, it could be him. Some people even suggested other identities, but that seems very far-fetched. So, either it's Ramesses I or it's nobody. So he went back to Egypt. More recently, Zahi's done his DNA studies and said that it confirmed that it was Ramesses I, but not everybody buys that analysis. So it's still a question there, but it's an intriguing possibility.
Has he published that material in a context?
Not as far as I know, but it may be coming. I don't know.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so for the individual in question, it's quite a long and circuitous journey to wind up in Niagara Falls and then Atlanta, and then you go through the rather lengthy and complicated process of identifying, first of all, is this a mummy of an approximately correct date? Is it indeed a royal mummy? Because, as you say, there are many periods where certain features might show up that appear royal. And then you, aggregating the physical sort of evidence from the body itself, you come to a rough conclusion that there is a very strong chance this is the individual Ramesses I. The next step of the process is one that I suspect the vast majority of people have no experience with, which is repatriating a human corpse to another country. How do you do that? I can't imagine it's a simple FedEx process. How does a museum curator go about organizing that kind of process with a foreign government?
Well, when we first started thinking about this possibility, we contacted the Egyptian Antiquities Service, and Zahi came over to look at it. And then once we decided to make the offer to repatriate it, we sent an official letter to the Egyptian embassy in Washington, and they accepted the offer. And then we got conservators to pack it very carefully and make a very elaborate case to hold it. Air France very kindly offered to fly it to Egypt. So it would have been rather expensive. And then it went back, and it was unveiled with great hubbub. There were tons of us there, and it preempted Egyptian TV, and there were big banners outside the Cairo Museum. So everybody was very, very happy.
Very good. Out of curiosity, was there any, once the mummy was positively identified as very likely to be a royal figure, was there any pressure from the local community in Atlanta to, no, we should keep this here because it will be very good for the museum and for tourism?
No, everybody was very supportive, everyone, because they felt it was the right thing. And again, it's not something we would display. So
that's a good point to clarify. So the mummy was never actually on public display. It was always in the conservator storage room.
We did, except for we did a little show around him before we sent him back, and in that case, we did have him on display. We recreated his sarcophagus and put him in the recreation of it, so he would at least be in context. But normally we wouldn't show a bare mummy.
So prior to identification, the mummy wasn't on display to the public, and then once you felt it was a fair bet, it was a brief exhibition.
Yes. Yeah.
Interesting. So yes, it's a fascinating story, and particularly on many levels in the modern era, it's a sort of a victory for, I guess, Egyptology as a modern scientific institution, both in the sense that the technological advancements of X-rays and CAT scans allow a great deal more certainty about the identity of a particular individual than you would have got even 60 or 100 years ago. And then it's also a victory in the sense that once the mummy was positively identified, it was a very smooth process to actually return it to the country of origin. I guess the last question I have on this particular aspect is more of a personal one. Having gone through this rather remarkable and quite novel experience, how do you feel about the process? How do you feel about Ramesses I and his body? When you see that figure lying in Luxor Museum, do you feel any sense of connection or kinship, or is there any sense of bittersweet melancholy about his journey? How do you feel about him?
No, I'm quite pleased he went back. I don't think anyone regrets sending him there.
I didn't mean in terms of sending him back. I meant more in terms of the difficult journey that he himself underwent in the modern world before he actually came home. It's something that Egyptologists often have to engage with, is the complicated history of these figures. So I was just curious, what do you feel when you look at him?
I don't know. I suppose he'd be happy flying back home. It sort of fits with ancient Egyptian afterlife beliefs. But no, I think it's good. I think everybody was very pleased, and it was a nice show of cooperation and mutual interest. There should be. I think it's important as a touchstone, because there's so many calls for repatriation now, and in the popular imagination, it gets kind of crazy that everything should go back, and it's clear that there should be a cooperation and a coming together of both sides, because there are many advantages to having some of this material outside of Egypt. Certainly, they can't display all of it. And again, it should be a point of cooperation rather than and more importantly, even I feel that the Seti the first fragments are important, because they're bits of a standing monument that should go back, part of an architectural whole, and there should be more of that, certainly.
Okay, let me touch on that briefly. So you mentioned these two fragments that you identified as possibly removed from the tomb of Seti I. What were the fragments exactly? What gave them away?
Well, the one gave it away because it was a piece with torus molding on the top, which is very like those in the storage chamber off the burial chamber of Seti I. And I'd seen other fragments in other museums from Seti I that had been collected and brought back in the 19th century. So I knew that these were things that were circulating back then. And they have a certain look to them. They were limestone and had a lot of paint on them. And so it jogged my memory that it could have been from there.
Interesting. And so the copies you made of them, were they placed in the tomb, and the originals are still in the museum? Is that correct?
No, we just fit them there to make sure that they fit, and then we sent the originals back, and they were put back in the tomb.
Oh, okay, excellent. So that's another victory of repatriation. Yeah. So the fragments themselves were just part of the architecture. Did somebody just remove them as a souvenir, essentially?
There was a lot of damage to the tomb, and so I think mostly people picked pieces up and brought them home, because there were some in the MFA in Boston. That's how I knew them. There were some in the Peabody Museum in Salem. Right. And then of course there were big, huge pieces in the Louvre and Florence. So
sure. It's interesting that those two specific monuments, Ramesses I and Seti I, both wind up circulating within your purview. Excellent. So one thing I'm curious about is, how often do you go and visit Ramesses?
I don't, unless I'm in the Luxor Museum for another purpose. I don't, I have lots of other things to do.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And now, part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Peter Lacovara.
Okay, excellent. So that brings me to the end of my questions about Ramesses I. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on with regards to that project specifically before I move on?
No, I think that's it. The jury's still out, but it seems to be more likely than not that it's him. But
sure,
so hopefully someday we'll know for sure.
Hopefully. Fingers crossed. So beyond Ramesses I, which is very much a sort of a museum curatorial project, and I guess you'd call scientific outreach program almost with the repatriation, let's move now to a project that you're involved in, which is on-site archaeology within Egypt. And this is something that you worked on through your PhD research and then published a book about in the late 1990s. The site in question and the modern name is called Deir el-Balas. And one of the reasons it's interesting is that it preserves a palace complex. There are very few palace complexes that we have well preserved from Egypt, and Deir el-Balas is one of the excellent examples. So the first question, I suppose, is what brought you to this site, and why is Deir el-Balas a significant palace specifically?
Okay, well, it started back when I was still a student, and I was working in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston then. And at that time, people were beginning to get interested in settlement archaeology. And I came across the records of this settlement that Reisner had excavated in 1900 and 1901, but never published. And the records were very sketchy. There were plans of some of the structures, houses and stuff, but they'd never been plotted on a general map. So they were kind of just floating in space. So it was unclear about the plan of the whole thing. So I was lucky I got a grant, dissertation grant from the American Research Center in Egypt, and went there to take a look at the site. And it was little money, so it was very Petrie-esque. I had to live in a tent and eat tuna fish out of tin cans and bathe by pouring water over my head. But I began kind of looking over and surveying the area, and began to be able to plot where a lot of these plans went. And then later I was able to raise a little bit more money and go back several seasons. And Mark Lehner actually helped me map the site. And so as we started putting it together, I began to see all these parallels to other royal cities, Malkata and Amarna. So there was the large royal palace in the center, just like Malkata and Amarna. There was a workmen's village. There were chapels for the workmen. There were houses for the elite. And it was very interesting because it was from the reign of Second Enrei. There had been several inscribed limestone pieces from there found by the ES and the Antiquities Service with Second Enrei's name on it, cartouche, and the pottery and all the other material indicated a late Second Intermediate Period, early New Kingdom date. And Reisner found in the abandonment debris ceilings of Achmoza. So it seems to have been used for just that brief period of time. So it was basically a campaign palace with a city along with it. And then it was interesting too, because after working there and going back to Boston, there was a drawer of ostraca, which had no provenance. They were just unlabeled, they had been in the basement. By looking at the sherds, I could tell that they were from Darrell Blas. They were the right period, the right material. It's just like now, it has a very fine marl wear. So I said, these are from Darrell Blas. And again, people said, oh, that's ridiculous. How can you tell where an ostraca is from by the sherd? And luckily, Barry Kemp had gotten the archive of F.W. Green, who'd worked with Reisner at Blas, and sent me some of the photographs from the archive, and in amongst them were photographs of the ostraca. So Stephen Quirk came over and translated them, and it was really interesting because they were lists of ships' crews and provisions for ships and soldiers. So again, confirming that it was sort of a campaign palace for the Hyksos expulsion. And then so I did my dissertation, and then museum work kind of dragged me away from excavation. But then in around 2016, after the revolution, the site had been looted and a lot of the land had been reclaimed by modern village. So Mustafa Waziri, who was then the chief inspector at Kenna, asked me to come back to try and help preserve the site, restore the things that were damaged. So I started going back. And so we did some restoration. There was a lot of damage too. There was a big structure at the south end of the site called the South Palace, which wasn't really a palace. It's, I think, like a watchtower. It's on the top of a high hill, and it gives a nice view of the whole surrounding area, and it has almost no occupation debris. It clearly was not any kind of settlement thing. And then what was interesting is that in doing restoration, after it had been tunneled into by looters, we found all these cedar beams from ships. So they had been recycling some of the wood from some of the damaged ships. So there were these big beams painted red of cedar that had been from the ship hull.
Wonderful. Do you, just on a personal query, do you have any photos of those you'd be willing to share just to illustrate for?
Yeah, sure. I'll send them to you. Yeah. If you want any images, I didn't know if you.
I was going to ask after the interview, just once I sort of figured out which parts were, most noteworthy and which people would have questions about. But yes, any sort of photos you have of the overall site. I haven't visited Deir al-Balas myself personally. So what is the site like from a physical, ground level perspective?
So it's like all these, most of these royal cities, it's desert edge. So it's on the desert edge of the cultivation. And it used to be, part of the problem is that it was on the margins of there was always a modern settlement there, but it was small. But it, like everywhere in Egypt now, it's grown exponentially. And then they built a new road across the desert, and so it's sort of now the site lays between them, and so there's a expansion outward there, so it's kind of in danger. But it's stretched along the road now, and the first thing you encounter is the South Palace, and then it's a modern pottery production area for balasses. And so, which is a good thing actually, because a large part of the site, they store the fuel, the hay and stalks of vegetables that they feed that they use to feed the ovens. So that actually protects what's under them. So fortunately, some of the area has been protected by that, but the site has expanded over a fair amount, and a lot of the houses have been destroyed. So our goal is to restore them, so that, because like with many of these sites, the only way they'll survive is if, from tourism, is if they have an economic value to the community, they won't be destroyed. Otherwise, the desire for the land is so tremendous that they won't survive. So we're doing rescue. The idea is to make it visitable for tourists in the future.
That's what I was going to ask. Are there plans to construct, like a visitor's center or a viewing sort of platform with explanation?
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so you came to the site partially through your graduate research and Reisner's material, which Barry Kemp was able to add to, and you and Mark Lehner did some of the early sort of surveying and study work, and then Stephen Quirk helped with translations. Is that a correct summary? Yep, great. Okay, so the project itself, now you've been involved with for approximately 30 plus years. I won't say exactly how many, but so obviously you have a long experience with this particular community and this particular location, but it's also must be a good opportunity to sort of reflect on how archaeology and technology has changed since you started the project at Deir al-Balas. So when you first arrived in there and started your surveying project, what tools were you using, and how is that different from what you're using today?
So, well, we were using kind of old-fashioned theodolites back then, and now, of course, we use Distamats and GPS and modern technology, which makes it a lot faster and more accurate. So, other than that, there's not much change as far as technique goes.
Have things like satellite photography helped you further with the site, identifying areas of interest and things?
Not really, because again, there's only so much you can tell from satellite imaging, and again, often they're only faint traces. The problem is, of course, like with many early archaeologists, Reisner didn't backfill. So even in the 1980s, some of the houses I was only able to identify by the pattern of the backfill, the back dirt dumps.
Oh, no.
Surrounded that, so the mud brick completely decayed. So again, it's because it's close to the surface there. So it depends. Some sites that works on, like I've worked at Abydos with Janet Richards, and there they did a ground penetrating survey, ground penetrating radar survey, and there thousands of tombs you can see. But then we tried it when I worked at Melkata, and you couldn't see anything because the bricks and the dirt are basically the same material, so they didn't register. So technology can only take you so far.
Absolutely. And
the big difference that, though, what's interesting is that when I started, there was a lot of interest in settlement archaeology that was beginning. Now, coming back, what I feel, and some others, Anna Stevens in particular, is that we really have to look at site preservation now. I mean, this has to be the focus of our work now, because they're not going to last unless we really work to document and protect these sites, because particularly the ones in out of the way areas like Deir al-Balas, but even Amarna is in great danger. So that's really, I think, the future of archaeology in Egypt, and probably everywhere, is site protection.
Okay, and we'll come back to that in just a moment with the Ancient Egypt Heritage and Archaeology Fund. So my final question about the sort of Deir al-Balas is the larger context of this site. So Deir al-Balas preserves the remains of a late 17th dynasty, early 18th dynasty palatial complex with its surrounding infrastructure, storehouses, elite houses, workmen's villages, and things like that. As we mentioned, Deir al-Balas, and as you've touched on, is not the only site that has this kind of material. We also have Amarna and Malkata on the west bank of Luxor, which is the palace of Amunhotep III. And then we have Abu Ghurab up near the Fayoum. Having studied all of these sites as part of a larger network, or at least a larger system of Egyptian organization, what would you say are the key features of a New Kingdom palace city when the pharaohs are establishing these new residences for themselves? What seem to be the key things they need and they want in their cities?
That's a good question. I think one of the things that connects the three, and probably others, is that they're built on virgin ground. It's an arena of sort of royal display, as Barry Kemp has talked about it. So they're kind of laid out at the desert edge, in order to showcase the pharaoh and his court, much like Versailles. And what's interesting is that, Barry Kemp again suggested that, the geological location of Amarna, in that wide bay in the limestone cliffs, sort of again, sets it in a kind of what O'Connor calls the axis mundi, a kind of of the universe. And what's interesting about Deir al-Balas is it's exactly the same. It's in the middle of a wide, but the palace is just like Amarna. It's in the center of a wide bay in the cliffs. So there's so much at Balas that prefigures Amarna, the layout. It's quite remarkable. Mm-hmm. What's funny is if you look at Fairman, who was the first to write really about town planning in ancient Egypt, he said, well, aside from the Amarna villa, the standard Amarna villa, so-called, there's not much Amarna can tell about town planning in Egypt because it's atypical. But I think now the reverse is true. Amarna is typical, but I think the Amarna house is actually atypical, that it's unlike other Egyptian houses because it's so uniform in plan. If you look at all the other New Kingdom cities, the houses are quite variable in plan, whereas at Amarna, there really is a kind of a basic template that the elites anyway, all follow, which I think is because it's from the top down. I think Akhenaten is planning the whole thing.
So just to clarify for the audience, so we're talking about the non-royal houses, the high officials and the king's favorite friends. At Amarna, we have a very substantial number of these, which you say follow a somewhat typical plan with a certain layout of rooms and design. Comparing that, and I'll show some pictures on this for those who are interested, comparing that with Deir al-Balas, which is, only 100, 150 years earlier, what kind of elite residences do we see around the palace? What do we have about them?
So again, they're houses like Amarna. They're often houses with a central courtyard, often kind of homespun industries around them. We found in the 80s, we found a textile workshop attached to one of these houses. But they're much more variable in plan. They're much more ad hoc construction than you see at Amarna.
So if, just off the top of my head, if a typical Amarna elite house has a sort of entrance hall and then a central room with a sort of podium and then a back complex and a staircase, what does a Deir al-Balas elite house look like?
So they're much more variable. So they don't have that arrangement. A lot of them do have kind of look like a central room, but they don't have the off-axis entryway. They don't have the series of the loggia, so-called, and the other rooms. They're much more variable than the Amarna houses.
Okay, so taking that into a sort of sociological speculation, would I be correct in saying that the Deir al-Balas one seems to be more bottom-up designed, whereas Amana elite houses are possibly more top-down mandated in terms of their
Exactly,
architecture?
exactly.
Okay.
I think that there it's a very deliberate design. And even with Urkern's village, the workman's village at Amarna is very rectilinear, whereas at Balas, it's much more like Deir al-Medina. It's much more freeform.
Interesting. Yes, and I'll have to ask you for some images of that just to illustrate the point as well. Okay, so in terms of how the site is positioned, Deir al-Balas is similar to Amarna in that you have these wide desert bays with the palace complex somewhat in the middle, and then you have elite houses clustering around them with their own support infrastructure. Focusing very narrowly just on the royal house itself, the palace complex, what are the key features in your mind? What are the key architectural features of the Deir al-Balas palace and New Kingdom palaces generally? When they're building these structures, what do they need and want first and foremost?
Well, unfortunately, it's a bit harder for Deir al-Balas because it was unusual in that it was built on casemate foundations, which are these cells of rectangular brickwork filled in with debris and then to form an elevated platform. So the second story of the palace, where the throne room presumably and living quarters were above that. But again, this was one of Reisner's first sites. And then, of course, since it's Deir al-Balas, the palace had been covered over later by perhaps a Roman and then a Coptic church built above. And so Reisner, not being interested in them, just kind of shaved them off, but took the upper floors of the New Kingdom palace along with them. So we only have the foundations now of those. So we can kind of speculate what it may have looked like, but we don't really have that anymore. But we do have the lower level, which had a series of column courts and then an off-axis entryway, like most royal palaces, very similar to Malkata in particular, and huge. It's about, we don't have the full extent because it runs under the modern village, the eastward end of the palace, but it's at least almost 50,000 square meters. So a very big structure.
And in the New Kingdom Royal City, you touch briefly on some of the decorative elements that were recovered from the foundations and the sites, and some of those are quite unique. Are you able to touch on those little decorative motifs, particularly around the campaigning elements?
Yeah, there was in the entryway, Reisner found a bit of wall painting of armed men, armed soldiers carrying axes. Unfortunately, he just did a rough sketch. He didn't photograph it, and it hasn't survived. And there were also faience tiles from the palace, which are actually very similar to the ones from Kerma. And there are lots of Kerma, there's lots of Kerma pottery there. There are names of Nubians in the Ostraca. So we know there's a lot of interaction with Nubia there. In fact, that's where I think that the whole casemate idea comes from.
Something I wanted to touch on is that you did note in your work many similarities between the Deir al-Balas architecture and what was identified at Kerma, I think by Bonnet.
Yes.
Are you able to touch on some of the more details of that and your speculation that the Theban royals got the idea for this structure from what they saw at Kerma?
Yeah, so the big royal tumuli of the last kings of Kerma, you begin to see them, because they're so huge, you begin to see them building cross walls in them to stabilize them. And then by the last one, by K3, the last of the classic Kerma ones, it's a very complex pattern of kind of very narrow cross walls, which are filled in with earth and then capped with mud brick. And of course, it's the same pattern. It's actually the same dimensions that you find in Deir al-Balas. And again, they're filled in with earth and rubble and then capped over with a layer of mud brick. So very similar. at Balas, they're using them as a foundation, whereas in Kerma, they're using them for tombs. But I think the Egyptians are kind of experimenting with the form. What's interesting is that we know from the way it's been built that the North Palace, the main palace, is earlier than the South Palace. And there, what they do is they actually use casemates to sculpt the top of the hill to make it look like a building. So it's not actually a building at all. It's just a hill, but it's been squared off with casemates to look like a building. So again, they're playing with this form. And then a little bit later, the Teti Sheri pyramid that's currently being worked on by Deborah Vishak is also done with casemate construction, which you don't find in other brick case, which you don't find in other pyramids. And it's not particularly successful, but you can tell that they're experimenting with this new technique.
I'll just have to make a note of that because that's an interesting point. Okay, so just to clarify, because I know that I'll get comments or questions about this. How do you determine which structure, the Deir al-Balas or the Kerma one, is earlier? Who's influencing whom? How do you confirm that?
Oh, because well, I think they're almost coeval. So I mean, because we have kind of classic Kerma pottery from Deir al-Balas, the tulip beakers, which you get in K3. And so we know the chronology it's very close there. So and we can see it evolving in Kerma, whereas it appears fully formed at Balas. So it's clearly going from south to north and not the reverse.
Very good. So we have the archaeological evidence from Kerma to document the development, and then it is fully formed at Deir al-Balas. Excellent. Thank you.
And now, part 3 of the conversation with Dr. Peter Lacovara.
Okay, well that brings me to the end, I think, of my questions about Deir al-Balas and the New Kingdom royal city. Is there anything else you'd like to touch on with regards to that? Anything that you're working on which I might not be aware of?
No, I think that's it. The thing is, a lot of these Balas and Melkata, they're much smaller than Amarna because they tend to feed off the royal cities, whereas Amarna had to be much more self-sustaining. So that's why it's so much larger. A lot of the court and the production necessities could be withdrawn from Thebes or wherever, Memphis, with the Merneptah Palace. But Amarna is a special case just because it is far away from everything else.
Yes, okay, absolutely. So at Deir al-Balas, to the best of my understanding, you've only found material from the late 17th and early 18th dynasty. Is that correct?
Yes, pretty much. There's a few little later New Kingdom stuff, and then there, of course, the Romano-Coptic material, and then there's some very few late period things. There's some Demotic papyri from there. I think after, just like Amarna, I think once the court leaves, you get some squatter occupation there for a time, and then it's completely abandoned.
Okay. And if you had to speculate, why do you think they established this particular palace at this particular site during this period?
Well, I think it's, again, it's a campaign palace, so it's not defensive, it's offensive. So I think it gave them, it's kind of strategically located because it's right at the Kenna Bend. So it's right across from Coptos, which is important politically. Also, again, it's a nice place, which I think that's why the South Palace is there, to gather the fleet. I think that's probably where the fleet was all assembled and then sent up to Avaris to destroy the Hyksos.
Okay. And why do you think they abandoned it specifically?
Well, again, it's because it was no longer needed. So the other facet of most of these royal cities is that they're special purpose cities. So Balas is a campaign palace. Malkata is for the Hebsed. So once their use is no longer needed, they are abandoned.
Very good. So now we've touched on on-site archaeology at Deir al-Balas, and we've touched on, modern museum archaeology, if you will, and repatriation with Ramesses I. But as you just mentioned, one of the key focuses for archaeologists working in Egypt is site preservation, and part of that is bound up in your work with the Ancient Egypt Heritage and Archaeology Fund. So, very briefly, what is the organization and what's its mission statement?
So it's basically for archaeological work. It's very small, so it's mostly my work, but also some publication as well, because of course publication is a big part of preservation. So we've also been publishing some old material as well as our current excavations. So it's mostly that to continue the work at Deir al-Balas in particular, and then do other archaeological publications. And also I've been doing interviews with American Egyptologists, so as a kind of podcast history of American Egyptology. So
excellent. And what kind of publications is the fund producing?
So we've done a preliminary report of our work at Deir al-Balas. We're about to come and publish my work at Malkata, or studies of it anyway. We published an English translation of Vladimir Schmidt's coffin book. It's the main source, although it's 100 years old now, but the main source of compendium of Egyptian funerary art. But it was in Danish, so not many people could access it, and it's long out of print. So we reprinted a translation that Ziff Junker very kindly did. And then we also published, Reisner had done an archaeological manual that never got published. So we published that as well, which is really an interesting take on his approach. I wouldn't use it as a manual today, although some of his technique is actually better than some people's. But
the historiographical value is still yeah. And are there any? You might have already done this, but I haven't seen it. Are there plans to publish or digitize the early work at Deir al-Balas in its own volume or own site?
Yes, I have a grant from the White Levy Fund for Archaeological Publications, which is a great organization. And so they give money to publish excavation reports. And so I'm planning on publishing Reisner's original work in 2 volumes, the first on the cemeteries, and then the second on the town, which of course, since our work is still ongoing, we'll put that off for a bit, but we're almost ready to publish the cemeteries, which is a lot. He excavated huge in just a few months, huge number of tombs.
Excellent. And out of curiosity, what goes into publishing older material like this? Say, for example, the compendium of funerary art that you mentioned. How does one do that, and what are the costs involved? Like, how much does a project like that actually run to?
Well, that was very, very reasonable, because it was long out of print, and we were very fortunate to have the translation by Ziff Junker. So it wasn't that much to assemble a publication. Malkata was a much more expensive, but
are we talking, just out of curiosity, single digit thousands or tens of thousands for a publication? What does it look like to the public?
Single digit thousands, yeah, or less, depending on some of the smaller ones are much less.
Not as expensive as one might expect necessarily.
We publish through Amazon, so it's a self-publishing venue, so it makes it faster and cheaper and much easier. They do all the distribution and sales. So
well, that's good, because that also means that if people want to contribute, then it means that every little bit helps that much more, because if the costs of producing these kind of publications are relatively low, then people are able to be a lot more effective. So how can people get involved and help with the archaeological fund? Do you accept, individual donations or even volunteer work if people are interested?
Yeah, we do accept individual donations. If they can go to our website, ancientegyptarchaeologyfund.com, and either mail a check or contribute through Facebook, through the Facebook page for the site. We don't really take volunteers because the Egyptians don't like it if you have people who don't have academic credentials. And also we don't have a lot of money, so we don't have a big staff, and I try to have at least equal number Egyptian and foreign excavators, because I think it's it's very important that we involve.
Excellent. What about for
and they're great. They're the new generation they're fabulous people, just terrific.
What about for the stateside work, with the publication or just the organization itself? If people were interested in assisting.
Sure, maybe. Yeah. There are lots of projects.
Right. Well, I'll put the link to the website in the episode description for this, and maybe we can at least generate some financial support. So hopefully that goes well. Yes. Well, Peter, that brings me to the end of my questions about your work. So thank you very much for speaking with the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Oh yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Thank you for your interest.
And please keep in touch and let me know of your ongoing work, because we'd love to have you back and discuss future developments at Deir al-Balas or Malkata or whatever you're involved with. Out of curiosity, are there any plans to do something like a digital reconstruction like Frank Monnier recently published for Malkata?
Yes, well, I was working with Frank on the Malkata stuff, and I have an old reconstruction of the palace that Andrew Boyce and Fran Weatherhead did. And then Frank did a kind of suggestion how we might restore the North Palace. Okay. So yeah, we hope to do that.
Watch this space, and I will update people as that comes about. So yes, Peter, thank you very much for speaking with the show, and I hope to see you again very soon.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, and take care.
My thanks to Peter for joining us on the History of Egypt podcast. If you'd like to learn more about his work, you can visit Peter's website at peterlacovara.com, link in the episode description. If you would like to support the Ancient Egyptian Heritage and Archaeology Fund with its conservation and excavation projects, you can visit their website at ancientegyptarchaeologyfund.com, or follow the link in the episode description. That's all from me. I'll see you on the next one. Take care, and may the great sun god Ra shine upon your palace and bring comfort to your household.